All right, so good afternoon to everyone that is joining us today for this week's RCC or the Rape Crisis Center roundtable. So our topic today is sexual assault and suicide, and I have some great some awesome ladies with me today that is going to help us kind of navigate through this discussion. So again, my name is Kelsey Bryant. I am with Lifeline's Counseling Services and the Rape Crisis Center. Ms. Catherine.
Hi, my name is Catherine Rogers. I am the Suicide Prevention Coordinator with Lifeline's Counseling Services. Katie?
Hey, I'm Katie Bourget. I am the Suicide Prevention Coordinator for the Alabama Suicide Prevention Resources Coalition, which is based in Birmingham.
Oh, so thank you so much, ladies, for being here today. All right, so like always, we're going to jump right in. And for those of you who are live with us today, we would love to hear from you. So if you have any questions or if you have any comments, please feel free to drop those in the chat and we will get to those as soon as we can. All right, so we're going to jump right in with our discussion. All right. So when we're speaking of suicide, what are some warning signs, some behaviors that we could possibly look for in a person that maybe contemplating or maybe considering or thinking about suicide?
Before we get into that, I do want to give a little trigger warning and do the
Yes.
National Suicide Hotline number. So if anything, if bringing up in the conversation now or later on tonight, if you literally have like a residual kind of heaviness about what we talked about today, we would love for you to reach out. The number is 1-800-273-8255. And you can easily just look up Suicide Prevention Hotline and it'll come up on any Google or anything like that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Catherine.
Of course. All right. So, Katie, I guess we could talk about the three different categories of warning signs and behaviors that we have for suicidal thoughts, which would be verbal clues, behavioral clues, and situational clues.
Mhm.
Do you want to talk about the verbal clues, Katie?
Yeah, sure. Basically, there are a couple of different types of verbal clues. Of course, somebody might be really upfront with talking about, hey, I'm thinking about suicide. Like, this is something that has been on my mind. I'm struggling right now. I'm thinking about ending my life. Um, those are some of the more direct verbal clues that you'll hear
Mhm.
from people. But a lot of times, those things are more indirect. They're a little harder to interpret, or you hear somebody say something and you think, I'm not really sure what that means.
Mhm.
Some of those things will be like, well, I'm just tired. I can't keep going this way. And you kind of stop and you think, okay, you can't keep going. What way? What does that mean? Sometimes people also phrase it like, I wish I could just go to sleep and never wake up. I think that's how a lot of suicidal thoughts start, is that people just need a break from the emotional pain. So there's a lot of different things that people might say that would clue you into them thinking about ending their life. But basically, if you hear somebody mention like they have a big change of plans coming soon that they've been vague about, or they feel like a burden to other people, or they feel hopeless, those are things you want to watch out for when you're talking to people.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into the behavioral and situational clues. So with behavioral clues, any previous suicide attempt is a
Mhm.
major red flag for us as people who deal with suicide prevention and answer the hotline. Acquiring a gun or stockpiling pills, this is also very much a we need to look out for because they have those kind of means. Co-occurring depression, moodiness, hopelessness, the fear of things never getting better is a huge red flag. Putting personal affairs in order, giving away those prized possessions, substance use, or even like unexplained anger, aggression, and irritability.
Mhm. Mhm.
There are also situational clues. Katie, do you want to go over the situational clues?
Yeah, and you probably got a more complete list, but kind of the way I explain situational clues is, those are things that happen to a person that might put them at higher risk for thinking about suicide. So they're kind of like risk factors. Um, and those things are any kind of loss that a person goes through. So it can be loss of a relationship, like if a close family member or friend passes away, especially if
Mhm.
that person dies from suicide, that can be a huge trigger for people to start thinking, having those thoughts. Um, Other similar losses would be like loss of income. So especially with, so many job losses due to COVID,
Mhm.
I know that's something that's been on a lot of people's minds is like, that financial instability can be really crushing for people. Um, Even loss of freedom. So somebody getting arrested, somebody getting expelled from school, um,
Mhm.
somebody, you know, moving across the country and just losing their support system.
Mhm.
So any kind of loss, and then kind of tying into our subject for today, the loss of safety when
Mhm.
you're sexually assaulted, that can be a huge trigger as well. As we'll talk about, a lot of people that are sexually assaulted, do go on to develop depression, develop, PTSD symptoms.
Right. Yeah. Are you ladies seeing any like reoccurring like situations or issues that people are calling in the line on the line about? Are there just some things that just keep popping up that may be um, you might see it in one caller and then in another caller they might be having similar issues or similar situations?
Yeah, I would say, and Katie, I'm not quite sure. Do you answer the hotline?
I don't. I work as a counselor part time, so I see people that have suicidal thoughts, but I
Okay.
don't answer the crisis line.
Okay.
Yeah. So what from, answering the hotline and seeing, clients who have suicidal thoughts, I would
Hmm.
say the main thing that we are seeing is like the depression and the hopelessness, and
Okay.
really just like things aren't getting better. With COVID, there was a lot, like Katie was saying, like the financial,
Hmm.
stability, being worried about that, being worried about sickness. And then, the fear of other people getting sick, that was a huge thing that we saw as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah. And I think just from some of the calls that I've personally had on the hotline, just the loneliness,
Mhm.
Mhm.
I
Absolutely.
think is really, really um, just almost paralyzing for some people. Not having that contact, not, just, having to be at home, even if they are still employed, just not
Mhm.
being able to see coworkers or see family or see friends, I think has been detrimental to a lot of people.
Yeah,
Just being lonely.
we're definitely relationship based. And so when we're
Yeah,
not having those relationships that we can see in person and kind of get out of our own, area, that could be really detrimental.
yeah. And how often does a suicide actually happen?
So for the
Do we have some breakdown on that?
we do. The World Health Organization and the CDC both do a lot of research every year to kind of track those statistics.
Hmm.
So for the United States, somebody dies from suicide about every 11 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And in
Okay.
addition to the death, we have 25 people have attempted in that same amount of time.
So every 11 minutes, someone dies by suicide. But in that time, you have 1 in 25 that are attempting during that same amount of time.
Yes, so we
Oh,
have one
wow.
death compared to 25 others who have attempted in basically since the time we started talking.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Mhm.
So again, like many of the issues, many of the topics that we cover here at Lifelines, suicide is another one of those taboo topics, that people, it makes people very uncomfortable. We don't want to, there's that myth that we talk about during prevention that if you talk about it, then it's going to cause a person to think about it or attempt suicide, and that's just not true. So I
Correct.
think there are definitely some myths, that need to be done away with when talking about suicide. So if someone dies by suicide every 11 minutes, we know that someone is sexually assaulted every 73 seconds. So I
So there's
know
a
you, yeah, there is a lot that is happening, each minute of the day. So, and I know you ladies talked about some of the verbal warning signs and the physical. What does that look like for a person who has been sexually traumatized?
Yeah, so with a person who's been sexually traumatized, we have a couple different things to look at. It's really the onset, like Katie was saying earlier, about depression and PTSD, that trauma. And we already know that whenever those mental health disorders come into play, it really affects the way that we're able to manage stress.
Yeah.
And sexual assault, sexual trauma in any way is very stressful. It's not just it's stressful in the moment and then we forget about it. It's stressful every moment from there on out.
Right, right. So you could essentially have someone that was functioning, may not have had the onset of these issues, but if they have been sexually assaulted, that will bring on all of those things.
Yes. So a little statistics regarding, PTSD, 94% of sexual assault victims will have PTSD symptoms 2 weeks after. So
Oh, wow.
94% will
Okay.
have it 2 weeks after. And by 9 months, 30% still show those PTSD symptoms. So it's definitely, something high up there
Yeah,
in regards to mental health. And then
right.
about 70% experience moderate to severe distress.
Okay. Katie, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that, of course, sexual assault is awful whenever it happens in somebody's life, but we see a lot of like the depression and PTSD show up that are especially severe if somebody's a kid and has been sexually assaulted.
Okay, good
Um,
point. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's, you don't have any kind of coping skills for dealing with that. And a lot of times
that's true.
kids have to, I mean, a lot of sexual assault survivors have to keep it secret what has happened, but especially with children, they just don't have the coping mechanisms to deal with
Hmm.
it. And, that's something that a lot of people will carry with them their entire lives.
Absolutely. That makes so much sense because if we're seeing adults that all of their whatever coping mechanisms or skills they had may have just gone out the window, and then you're speaking or working with a child who does not have them at all, who has not been able to develop them, and now they've been traumatized by sexual violence. So yeah, I could see how they just would not cope well at all.
And they don't
Awesome.
understand, they don't have the language to describe what's happened. I mean, they're just
Right,
really not equipped to deal with trauma of that nature.
right. Okay.
And
Would you say that children are at a higher risk of contemplating, or is it about the same with children and adults, or adults more at risk? What do you ladies think?
so at the ages 10 to 34 have the highest rate of death by suicide. And that's, the young adolescents, those are the highest. So 10 to 34. But actually, the ones that are more likely to die by suicide are older white men. So it's not
Okay.
necessarily that children, but they are, that's the second leading cause of death for adolescents in that age bracket, 10 to 34.
Wow. That's something to really think about. And I'm glad you gave that statistic because Lori just asked, are there other populations who are more at risk? If so, what are some of those reasons? So let's I'm trying to keep all of these stats together and
A
who's
lot.
more at risk and who's not, but it's just so much. And I don't think people really realize um, how often sexual violence happens, and I don't really think they realize how often someone dies by suicide.
Yeah.
Well, it's
They
something we
know it's
don't talk
happening,
about.
It's
right?
definitely something we don't talk about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because we're not having those conversations. And again, just like, getting comfortable with having these conversations, all these conversations need to include everybody, whether
Right.
you're an adult, high school, middle school, elementary school, whether you identify as male, female, non-binary. I mean, everybody needs to be included in these conversations.
Yeah.
Nobody
Yeah,
needs to be left out, because sometimes we think it's a female thing or it's a male thing, and all of these issues are everybody's issue.
yeah. And that's
Yeah,
one of the main points that we make in every, so we do QPR trainings, and they stand for
yeah,
question, persuade, and refer. And it's on training, everyday common lay people about what to do with suicide. And one of the main like points that we make is that suicide is non-discriminatory. Like you
right,
said, like it doesn't matter what age you are, what race you are, what gender you are, what sexual orientation you are, you can still have the possibility of having those suicidal thoughts. So in regards to Lori's answer, I can break down some numbers. So
yeah,
in
yeah, that's
2019,
yeah,
we had 47,511 deaths by suicide. So about 47,000 deaths by suicide in America alone.
okay,
Of that, Caucasians were the highest amount of deaths, specifically those white older males. But the highest like group based on population size is American Indians and Alaska Natives. Those
okay,
are one of the highest risk groups.
okay,
And then after that, it's Hispanics. We had death by suicide for Hispanics was like 4,000.
okay,
And then African American, 3,000, Asian, 1,000, and then it keeps going down from there.
okay.
But definitely Caucasians and American Indian and Alaska Natives.
Do we know why?
There are many different reasons
Yeah,
why. We could go on. Katie and I can go on for days
I
on
would
the.
love to hear some of those. I know we, some of these things we're kind of throwing in there as we're having the conversation, but I would love to hear some of the reasons why those groups are so high on the list there. I mean, are there there's some different factors that people need to know about, or why is that happening that way?
I think to me, just from working with people that have been suicidal and from the research that I've seen, of
Mhm.
course, there's never just one reason that somebody
Right.
is suicide. I mean, maybe there is in like a crisis situation, but a lot of times it is. I had a professor that called suicide the death by 1,000 cuts. So that pain builds up and builds up and builds up. And when you have these systemic issues like, you know, sexism, homophobia, racism, dealing with financial stress, dealing with lack of access to housing, all of that, all of those stressors build that emotional pain. Each one of those is one of the cuts that can eventually lead to someone thinking about suicide. So, um, there are a lot of answers to your question, and there's
Yeah.
no specific answers at the same
Yeah.
time. Suicide is so different for each person that's going through it
Mhm.
that it's really important. Like Catherine said, we teach this in QPR. It's important to talk to that person about why specifically they are feeling hopeless and feeling like they can't keep going on. We want to understand it like from their perspective, what is making life not worth living anymore.
Okay. Yeah. That's a great way that your professor put that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
definitely
That stuck with me.
multifaceted. It's not just one thing that has happened in their life that has gotten them to this point. There are many different things.
All credit to Dr. Judith Harrington.
Yeah, that was a great way to put that. Yeah. Catherine, can you think of anything or any of those factors, those risk factors that might have gotten them, to this point, just off the top of your head or from some of your conversations or what have you?
Yeah, so trauma,
Okay.
especially intergenerational trauma. So
Okay.
even though, and I'm a psych nerd, so I can go on, like you said, for like ever about this,
Yeah.
but anything that our ancestors have gone through has been passed down to us through our DNA. So it's like we might not
Yep.
have personally gone through what they have gone through, but our DNA says that we have.
Let's let
So,
that soak in for a second,
right.
because there's a lot to be said about generational trauma. So we're talking about things that have happened hundreds of years ago. And some of those things we could go into specifics about. If we want to just throw one out there, slavery. Those are things that, we still carry. And I don't
Yeah.
think most people really realize how much of that trauma we are still carrying. So there's something to be said about that. So I just wanted to kind of sit with that for a second. Okay, what are some others?
Definitely one of those awkward conversations
Mhm.
is that intergenerational trauma. So we have the intergenerational trauma. Substance use is a really big one,
Yeah.
especially with our American Indians and our Native American natives, Indian, you know what I mean. So we have that as a big factor. And then as well as men are more likely to die by suicide because they use lethal means. So actually
Right.
women are more likely to attempt suicide, but they are it's a less lethal mean. That doesn't make it any less serious of their
Right.
attempt
Right.
or what they're going through, but men are more likely to die by those lethal means.
Yeah.
And same with our veteran populations. I mean,
Yes.
just having access to more lethal means always leads to higher suicide rates. And we see that in Alabama too. I mean, we're, statistically more likely to be gun owners, and we see that reflected in our suicide rates because nationally, about 50% of people who die from suicide use firearms, but
Yeah.
in Alabama, it's 70%.
Oh,
And
wow.
our suicide rates are higher than the national average because of that.
Because of us owning guns.
Yeah.
Because of that means, those lethal means. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the fact that a lot of our children have access to those guns as well.
That's why a part of our QPR presentation is always saying, like, absolutely keep your guns, but keep them in a safe place. Keep them with a gun lock, keep the bullets unloaded from them, keep them away from your kids. And if there's somebody in your household that's thinking about suicide or dealing with depression, get that gun out of your house.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
We want to put as much space between the means and the body as possible.
Right. And you brought up a very good point, Katie. You're saying if you know that someone in your house is contemplating suicide, and a lot of times those warning signs are very easy to miss.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Especially if they've been building for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
This is another myth that we talk about in the QPR presentation is, there's a myth that if somebody's talking about suicide or if they're just, a depressed person, they're not really going to try it. It's death by a thousand cuts. It builds up. If somebody is talking about suicide, it's because that thought is there. They're not joking about it. They're not like posting that, bleak status update for fun. It's a cry for help.
Right. And, as you guys always say during your QPR training, you want to take all of these things seriously. You don't want to sweep it under the rug. You don't want to pretend like it's not happening or that it could happen or that this person is actually having these thoughts. You want to take all of these warning signs or behaviors or, words or whatever. You want to take them seriously.
Yeah. And once you take it seriously, it shows that you care. Right? A lot of people are like scared that, their friend is going to get mad if you ask them about suicide. But it's showing like, hey, I care about your emotion. I'm caring enough to see these things in your life that you're trying to show me.
Right. I mean, that could literally be the difference between life and death.
Mm-hmm.
You could literally be talking them off the ledge or the edge and you not even know it. So yeah, I think it's just, all about, and we're talking about suicide and sexual violence. So two very, very heavy topics, but we have to start getting more comfortable with talking about these things because they're in our faces every day.
Yeah.
They're in our faces every day. And how would you ladies, Lori has again posed a question, how can we support those individuals that may be contemplating suicide? How do we support them and what resources do we provide for them?
Well, I think
Go ahead,
Catherine, go ahead.
I was just going to throw out this statistic because I'm a statistic person about specifically sexual assault and suicide and how it leads to that. And then we can definitely get in because Katie has tons of information that could help.
Whoever wants to go first, I'm good with that.
So we know that 1/3 of sexual assault survivors think about suicide. And so there are 4.1 more times likely to think about suicide than any like non-sexual assault victim.
Mhm.
and 13% actually go on to complete. So there are like there is an increased chance of suicide due to sexual assault.
Yeah. So the likelihood of someone that has been assaulted contemplating suicide, the likelihood is very high
Yes.
for a lot of the reasons that we have been stating for weeks. Just the shame. Have they been threatened in any way? The blame, just the stigma along that goes along with that. I think it's just paralyzing. Again, it's just detrimental to a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Katie.
Well, I'm just, when you asked that question, I was going back to what you were saying a second ago, is that the thing that makes the most difference for people is just being there and listening.
Yeah.
That's something we teach in our QPR presentation too. That's something that, crisis workers have said over and over, is it's not about saying the right thing. Because I think a lot of times there's that pressure to
Yeah.
know, oh my gosh, how do I respond to this? I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to make them more upset. But you just being willing to have that conversation, you being willing to sit with them and
Yeah.
hold a space for them to tell you what's going on.
Mhm.
I mean, the research shows that that is what opens up those lines of communication, reduces anxiety for somebody that's feeling that way. It gives them a lifeline. It's
Right.
like
That's
lifeline
it.
counseling. It gives
That's
them,
it. That's it.
yeah, exactly. It gives them the space to just, open up about their feelings. They don't have to carry that pain by
Yeah.
themselves anymore.
And I think it's also important to know that if you are noticing someone is different, something is just not right. We all have that gut feeling, and we have it for a reason. And usually, if your gut is telling you something, you need to pay attention. Pay attention. But if you yourself, if you don't know the right direction to point that person in, or you don't know the resources, or you just don't know how to help them, get them to someone who can. Don't just
Absolutely.
ignore it, or anything like that, but make sure you direct them to a person who can definitely assist them.
And there are so many resources out there. I mean,
Yeah.
the crisis line that Catherine mentioned at the beginning of the talk today, I give that to all of my clients. I say, if
Mhm.
you need somebody to talk to, they are literally there 24/7,
Right.
365 days a year. You can call them at midnight on Christmas. Like, you know,
Yeah, that's
there are
right.
resources out there because we know how important it is to have someone to talk to when you're feeling that way.
Yeah. Are there any other resources besides the crisis line that people can reach out to?
Yeah. There's also a chat form, which a lot of our younger Gen Z likes to use.
Okay.
Um, Text form as well. You can also like text home to 741-741, and you can talk about any mental health, suicide, anything like that. Um, there's also, I know our rape crisis volunteers are trained in how
Yep.
to deal with suicide, as well as Katie's. Katie up in Birmingham has the crisis center that does both as well. There's also the Trevor Foundation for LGBTQ youth that is very beneficial, and I have the number, or you can look it up, but it is 1-866-488-7386. And all of those are very 24/7 there to help you when you need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other resources that we need to mention?
Just a couple more specific ones.
Okay.
Like Catherine said, there are different crisis lines for different populations. So like
Hmm.
there's one for LGBTQ there's actually multiple. There is the veterans crisis line. So when you call the national crisis line, I think it's, you call the number and then you press 1 to be
Okay.
taken to the veterans crisis line. The Birmingham Crisis Center also has their own number.
Okay.
So for those in the Birmingham area, it's 205-323-7777. And they also have a separate hotline for rape response. So there
Okay.
will be a lot of hotlines for like rape response, sexual assault, domestic violence, things like that as well.
Yeah. So there are definitely resources available.
Yeah.
And please don't continue to suffer in silence, whether you're contemplating suicide, or you have been sexually assaulted. There are people who want to help you and that are in your corner. And I know there are so many people that are, that are suffering because some people even don't want to be a bother to anyone else. They don't want to talk about their business, but they are definitely suffering every day. And before we wrap it up and kind of give the other crisis line, is there some verbiage or some words that should not be used, or some things that may have changed when it applies to suicide? I know we talked a little about that earlier before we got on.
Mhm. Yeah, to me, always my like soapbox is that we don't want to say somebody is committing suicide. Because to
Hmm.
me, in my mind, committing is something that's a crime or something that's a sin.
Hmm.
And suicide is neither one of those. It's a
Hmm.
state of being where you're so in pain that you just can't keep going. It's a
Hmm.
medical issue that happens to somebody. So, kind of the preferred terminology instead of commit suicide is die from suicide, die by suicide. I've even heard people use the term suicided, so turning it into a verb.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So to me, that's you know, it's a little bit of a different way of saying it, but the implications of that make such a difference. It's a more compassionate way of talking about suicide.
Exactly. Exactly.
And I think another important thing to think about when talking about it is not to say that somebody like succeeded or they failed in their suicide attempt, because
Mm.
dying by suicide is never a success, right? And so
Mhm.
just not using those kind of terms and really, focusing that this is a person and not just a statistic or not just another story that you're hearing about, but it's a person, it is a child, it is possibly a parent, a family member. So
Right.
using words like that and really just being person centered. So having that person centered idea in language. So if somebody has diabetes, you don't say that person is diabetes, right? Just
Mhm.
like you wouldn't say that person is suicidal. You would say that person like has suicidal thoughts. It's
Mhm.
not their identity. It is something that they have and something that they're dealing with, not something that consumes them entirely.
Awesome. Yeah, I totally agree. And just staying away from that judgment, because I know it's so easy. I know it's so easy, and then, if it's someone who is young, some adults and some older adults may say, well, well, they shouldn't have any problems, or, they're what do they have to be stressed about? And we can't say that. Whether you're young, older, in between, everybody has struggles.
You
So
don't know
we
what
just
another person is going through.
right, exactly. Well said, Katie.
And
All
even if
right,
you've gone through that yourself, it's not the same as what that other
right,
person is dealing with.
right. That's right. All right. Anything else, ladies? We need to maybe add, because I'm sure we could probably go on for forever about this topic, because I know that you ladies are very compassionate. Just about spreading awareness and letting people know their resources and letting them know that we are here.
Mhm.
So if you are watching, or if you know someone who is suffering in silence, whether by they're having suicidal thoughts or they have been sexually assaulted, the sexual assault crisis line is, if you are in Mobile, Clark, or Washington counties, um, you can dial our number. It is 24/7. So you have access to 24/7 advocacy. So that number is 251-473-7273. Now, don't let that stop you. So if you are outside of those counties, maybe you're not even in the state of Alabama and you want to talk. So that number outside of Mobile is going to be 1-800-718-7273. And Catherine, go ahead and give the crisis line number one more time.
Yeah, it's 1-800-273 8255.
Yes. So please reach out. All are welcome to call those lines. Please don't continue to suffer in silence. And if you are advocating for someone else, please make sure that you give them the resources that they need. So thank you again, ladies, for being here. And thank you to all who have joined in the conversation. Thank you to all who will view this later. So we will be back next week, same time, same place, just with a different topic. So until next time, everybody take good care.